Cuba is literally asking for war at this point, guys. Look at how close they put their country to ours. At least that's how war works in civilization games. But jokes aside, is the United States about to attack Cuba? In a recent meeting with Latin American leadership, President Donald Trump claimed that Cuba was about to collapse, saying that he looks forward to the, quote, great change that will be coming to Cuba, and that the government in charge was in the last moments of life. If that is a little too vague for you, he later said, quote,
maybe a friendly takeover, it may not be a friendly takeover, it wouldn't matter.
Not friendly takeovers look like this, by the way. These kinds of statements are about as subtle as a train crash, and the nothing ever happens crowd has been wrong more times than they've been right this year. So is Cuba the next target? We'll Bay of Pigs the like and subscribe button, and let's talk about it. We ain't even a third through the year of 2026, and so far, the United States has already taken out 2 heads of state, along with the other kinetic shenanigans we've been performing as of late. If and when Iran gets wrapped up, the signs are all pointing that Cuba is going to be the next focus. I say signs, but that's literally what they're saying. But I have a slight hankering that this might go a little differently. Emphasis on slight, though. I am 0 for 2 this year on predicting what the US military does. But outside of just rhetoric, what are the other signs that Cuba is about to involuntarily have to get a new president? Well, the recent Venezuelan vacation we gave Delta Force this year has had major ripple effects on the communist island nation in just the short time since. Cuba is only able to produce about 40% of its own oil, and their domestic production is primarily for electricity generation and power plants. Mexican oil makes about 44% of total usage, Russia 10%, and Venezuela formerly 33%, with the rest coming from random places here and there. That means that 1 in every 3 barrels of oil that Cuba uses for electricity and other things used to come from the country whose president we just yoinked. Though, according to Euronews, that number jumps up to 70% at certain times of the year. Not only have those exports from Cuba not resumed since we sent black helicopters into Caracas, but we've placed massive restrictions or outright bans on other countries trying to sell oil to Cuba. American military forces have been seizing oil tankers that were on their way to the island, and Russian Shadow Fleet tankers have recently been targets for the United States and NATO countries alike. The US Treasury announced a few roundabout ways for countries to export oil to Cuba, but it is very expensive, requires about 100 different middlemen, and can only be legally used for private industry or humanitarian purposes. It specifically cannot go towards the government or the military. At this point, I'd have better luck trying to teach my cat Miso how to speak Chinese than I would trying to sell a gallon of crude to the Cubans. And that's actually harder than you might realize because Miso here doesn't actually have a brain. Now, all combined, this has led to a massive energy crisis on the island, leading to constant blackouts and severe economic issues. In fact, a report from the New York Times states that the country is currently in its worst economic period since the current government was established 67 years ago. Food shortages have become more common over the last several years, public health issues are on the rise, and in 2025, the Cuban economy shrank 4% in the last quarter alone. Protests have started to pop up in the streets, and most headlines you read about Cuba as it stands begin by saying that they are on the, quote, brink of collapse. Same, to be honest. But this combined with comments from the US government all point towards that the 160th might be swooping in on Havana here soon. But could they? Or is Cuba able to defend itself better than Venezuela or Iran? No. No, they couldn't, short and sweet. But we're going to talk about their military anyway. Cuba's military, the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, is divided into an army, navy, and an air force, and that also controls their air defense assets. They also have a detachment of special forces called the BMTE, nicknamed the Black Wasps. When Delta Force raided Maduro's compound and schwacked 32 Cubans, it was those guys that they were fighting in that instance. If you look at the Cuban military as a whole, it kind of just looks like a bunch of cosplayers doing 70s Cold War reenactments. In the case of an American kinetic strike on the island, their anti-air assets would be the first to get hit. The majority of things Cuba has that could shoot down aircraft are just man-pads like the Strela or IGLA, or they're gun-based like the towed ZU-23 or self-propelled ZSU-57. None of these present significant threats to most American aircraft, and that includes the non-stealth planes that we have. All of Cuba's air detection radars are also Cold War relics. They'd have been useful if we planned on dropping napalm canisters from F-4 Phantoms like we did in the 60s, but I have about as much chance of detecting an F-35 as I do trying to impress women with my 15-year-old Honda Civic. Their accompanying AA missiles are in a similar boat. Strela 1s and 10s make up the overwhelming majority of their SAM batteries. But even if Cuba had the absolute latest version of the missiles that these things fire, which they don't, they'd only be able to engage targets up to 3,500 feet in altitude. That makes them a threat to helicopters, but not much else in America's arsenal. But before I talk more about the stuff they use to shoot planes down, a quick word. Now, if you're a regular here on the channel, you know that politics are constantly shifting, new military conflicts keep popping up everywhere, and military technology continuously increases our ability to blow things up with every passing day. Society is getting increasingly more chaotic and unpredictable, and there are some things, though, that will always be predictable, like physical gold and silver from American Hartford Gold. No algorithm, no trust us, it'll be fine, just tangible assets that have survived wars, collapses, and every overconfident economic experiment humanity has tried so far. American Hartford Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of 5-star reviews. You can get premium quality gold and silver shipped directly to your door, or stored securely in a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And right now, when you call and mention my name, Justin, you could get up to $20,000 in free silver with your first purchase. Call 866-970-5116 or text Justin to 65532. That's 866-970-5116 or text JUSTIN to 65532, or just click on the link in my description. Thank you to American Hartford Gold for sponsoring the channel, and now back to the video. Probably the biggest anti-air threat that they own is the 2K12 Cub SAM, of which they are estimated to have 3. These are pretty old, first being designed in 1958, but for Cuba, they recently did get a little bit of an upgrade courtesy of our friends over in Belarus. The Belarusians provided newer models that have better accuracy and tracking capabilities, but if we're being realistic about things, it's not really anything to write home about. It's kind of like if North Korea and South Sudan teamed up and then put angled foregrips on cowboy lever-action rifles. I appreciate the spirit, but it ain't gonna do much. Also, I just want to take a quick moment to enjoy this video of the Belarusian president just straight up drinking cooking oil. Dude is fat maxing for sure. In broad strokes, Cuba's ability to retain their own skies is significantly less than Venezuela's or Iran's on a good day. The Cuban Air Force is also very much lacking in the fighting plane department. On the books, they operate a handful of MiG-23 and MiG-21 multi-role aircraft. And while the MiG-21 is just pure vibes and sex appeal, it is hilariously behind the power curve in 2026. Many experts assess that when it comes to these two aircraft models specifically, there is a strong chance that none of them are actually operational in any sense. Accuse me of propaganda all you want, but it ain't exactly easy to find spare parts for a third-gen Soviet fighter that hasn't been in production for literally 40 years. It's not necessarily Cuba's fault, it's just how it is. Their most capable fighter is the MiG-29. Reported numbers of how many they have or had vary from source to source, some saying as many as 14 and others as low as 3. Cuba got these from the Soviet Union back in 1989, and all things considered, these planes are firmly in the okay category in terms of capability. That said, Cuba has also struggled keeping these in the sky, and some sources claim that only one of these is operational at any given time, while the rest sit in storage for parts cannibalization to keep the one going. It's important to keep in mind that air forces are expensive and maintenance heavy if you want to keep them going, and Cuba is certainly not the only air force in the world to have similar numbers. If you know that launching the few aircraft you do have will be an exercise in how to turn a pilot into a high school level physics problem, there really isn't a lot of point in dumping money into them. If we look at their Navy, it consists of a couple combat frigates, about a dozen missile boats and minesweepers, one anti-submarine corvette, and a single Yugo-class submarine that they got with the help of our friends in North Korea. Yugo classes are midget submarines meant mostly for espionage and infiltration, not for fighting. And don't cancel me for saying midget submarines, that is what they're called. And the politically correct term little person submarine makes me think that this is just a Red October parody where all the crew are shorter than 4 feet tall. I would 100% watch that movie though, but as we have seen, the United States is pretty good at knocking out ships both big and small. so their navy, like the Air Force, does not really have the ability to influence the fight. Now, the Cuban army does have a lot of ground vehicles, on paper at least. Reportedly, they operate a fleet of about 1,550 tanks. Admittedly, 1,100 of those are vintage T-55s, and the rest are either T-62s or the light tank P-276. So they ain't exactly fighting in the 21st century with these. But tank is still better than no tank, and these are complemented by the other vehicles you'd expect, like first-generation BMP-1s and older BTR models. Again, not exactly the newest platforms on the block, but they do exist in person, and they can theoretically blow things up. As the Honorable Dr. Prophet Chieftain once said, if all you have is a rifle, the difference between an M1 Abrams and an M4 Sherman is purely academic. The only vehicles that we would consider contemporary, I wouldn't even call them modern, that Cuba has are small batches of Chinese utility trucks that they received in the early 2010s. Cuban armored vehicles, by all accounts, are in better shape than their Air Force, but these have all been obsolete since the 70s, let alone the 2020s. The small arms their troops carry got the same treatment, or lack of treatment rather, being a mixture of Soviet, North Korean, and a sprinkle of domestic copies of each. When you have weapons on the books that link back to the Russian Empire in use, you know that you're well past due for an upgrade. Cuban military equipment is mostly comprised of cheap sales or straight-up donations from the Soviet Union and a handful of other countries, meaning of course they weren't going to get the good stuff for free, even during the Cold War. When the USSR fell, Cuba lost the one country keeping its military going, and it's been in a steady state of decay ever since. All that is to say is that if the United States wanted to, it would be very easy to conduct a military operation with little risk. Not zero risk, but certainly less than Iran or Venezuela. Not to mention that because Cuba is so close, it would be much easier to move military assets into the region. We could basically just launch all of our stuff from the actual continental United States or Puerto Rico if we really wanted to. No carriers required. You might be thinking, what about Guantanamo Bay? In case you forgot, the United States owns a nice little 45 square mile harbor area on the southern end of Cuba. Obviously, in the case of a direct attack on Cuba by the US, old Gitmo would probably come under fire. You would think that, but that's technically impossible. The US pays an annual lease to Cuba specifically so they don't attack us. And I doubt Cuba wants to be called into small claims court for any property damage their tanks would cause. Fun fact, the Cubans don't actually cash the check the United States sends them out of protests. But Guantanamo Bay sits in a very defensible position, with advantageous terrain, and is built with the idea that it would need to be able to hold out for a couple days before American reinforcements arrive to counterattack. How I'm sure that would actually play out, I'm not sure. But Cuba trying to seize it from defenders while simultaneously trying to defend against American attacks is probably not the most efficient use of military resources. Now, despite these criticisms, the Cuban military does actually have a good bit of actual combat experience. The vast majority of it has been supporting certain international conflicts or defending local allies. These guys have fought in a ton of places like Nicaragua, Ethiopia, Grenada, and even Israel. They don't exactly have the best win-loss ratio, but they have secured a few dubs here and there, and honestly, good for them. But that part right there starts to get into why the United States wants to see a regime change in the first place. If you are a country that doesn't like the United States, odds are you have some military connection to Cuba. Russia, China, and North Korea have all helped train Cuban soldiers at one point or another, and vice versa. The American and Cuban governments have never really gotten along, and while I try to not be too alarmist on this channel or exaggerate things too much, I personally would go so far as to say that they actively dislike each other. We literally tried to kill Fidel Castro 638 times. Allegedly, at least. The CIA claims it only tried 8 times, but both of those numbers sound fake to me. During the Cold War, as you probably know, Cuba was a close ally of the Soviet Union, which of course was annoying, to say the least, to the United States, due to how close the island is to us. It's only about 90 miles away from our territory. We tried regime change with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Cuban Missile Crisis made us all about one step away from having to play Fallout in real life. I won't be covering the entirety of Cuban Cold War history here, so if you need a refresher, just go play the first mission of the original Black Ops game. Cuba is mostly an import economy. They have to get their stuff from other places. So to even out trade relations, they exported people with skill sets. This included military assistance, medical services, and generally just things that required training and knowledge, but not necessarily a factory. And that largely held true until today. One of the reasons why Venezuelan oil made up such a large portion of Cuban imports is because they were sold at a subsidized cheap rates, with Cuba offering personnel support in return. Getting discounts on imports is fine and all, but it's not enough to grow and/or sustain an economy. Now, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of Cuba's inefficient communist economy compounded with crushing Western sanctions for 60 years and how that led us to where we are today. That is a giant can of whatabouts and what-ifs that I do not want to open. Also, I don't know how money works, and sarcastic army mustache man is deciding to stay in his own lane here. But Cuba is in a much more precarious position internationally compared to Iran and Venezuela. Unlike those two countries, Cuba doesn't have the resources or economic interest of either. Cuba does not export oil or have the capability to affect global markets by shutting down shipping lanes. The consequences of American strikes would have a much lower impact on the world's economy. And this is a very cynical next sentence, but it's true. The world really doesn't care about Cuba in the same way that it cares about the other countries the United States had engaged recently. That, of course, lowers the barrier of entry for America to do an epic fury to Cuba, or should I say, Le Epic Bacon, Rafflecopter. But if Cuba doesn't have anything we really want, resource-wise at least, why is the United States putting so much pressure and what feels like hints of an invasion on it? It's a little foggy, and if you aren't familiar with American history as much, it's probably even more confusing. First and foremost, the world is heating up again. Conflicts are breaking out more and more, and international relations haven't been this bad in a while. China remains Cuba's only political and economic partner, not currently recovering from or currently engulfed in a war. One of the major pushes in American policy over the last year or so has been reducing Chinese influence in South America. The PRC has already sold Cuba military hardware on the cheap, and the island nation tends to suffer without a strong external ally supporting it, meaning they are very willing to cooperate with other people. For the moment, China is signaling that they could fill that role. But for some reason, imagining Xi Jinping speaking Spanish is just kind of funny to me. Cuba, like it was in the Cold War, is still a big island that does not like us, and they could, in theory, have missiles pointing north if put there. That is the final ultimate logical conclusion to the argument, and I doubt we'll even get too close to reaching that point, but it would provide a potential strategic issue if large-scale war were to break out against the country that Cuba aligns itself with. Performing military action in Cuba would also be a lot more popular in the States than you might realize. The US has a sizable Cuban diaspora, aka Cubans who are now American citizens, all of whom either are or are descendants from people who escaped to the US during the communist takeover. That population does not like the sitting Cuban government, and they also vote, so it would probably lead to a net positive come election season, even if and when other people got angry. Marco Rubio, America's Secretary of State himself, is the son of 2 Cuban refugees. Having full control over the Caribbean has also been a priority for the current administration, as is evident by the fact that I cannot open up any social media without watching another boat get blown up. Having control, or at least nominal control over Cuba, falls in line with that in both a practical and symbolic sense. And finally, if we were to just open the markets in Cuba after decades of sanctions, it would mean a lot of economic opportunity for us northern neighbors. One must always keep in mind the influence of the mighty dollar when looking at these things. All the pieces seem to be in place for America to hit them next. The president is saying the government is about to go down, the population is suffering by all accounts and starting to protest against the regime. And the two sides have historically never liked each other. It was the same in Venezuela and the same thing for Iran. But Cuba, at least on the surface, seems to be doing things a little differently at the moment. The US has reportedly been having, quote, secret talks with Cuban leadership. How secret those actually are if we are currently talking about them is questionable. But subjects of discussion included a deliberate exit strategy for the sitting government, shifting away from the established communist-run economy, and making the United States Cuba's primary source of oil. And that last one, of course, being the big kicker, because it provides leverage for the US to influence policy change on the island. Externally, though, the Cuban government has denied that official talks have occurred at all, and that they would not be bending to American desires, while also pushing for plans to create a more self-reliant Cuba. Unofficially, though, Cuban officials in the United States have expressed their willingness to conduct bilateral talks, with the Cuban ambassador saying, quote, "We are sure that it is possible to find a solution." The American Justice Department is apparently putting together potential federal charges against certain Cuban government officials, which would provide, at least in a very, very loose sense, the legal justification for more Delta Force yoinking operations. Without diving too much into the details, mostly because current details are mostly just news agency speculations, it seems that Cuban leadership is, at least on the surface, more open to talks and negotiations with the United States. While formally Cuba is run by their sitting president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, in a realistic, practical sense, it is run by the military brass and Castro loyalists, who control major portions of the economy, and it's those Castro fanboys that have been doing talks with the US. Those guys benefit a lot if they stay in power, and the only way that seems to be possible is if they start getting buddy-buddy with the same country they hate and/or hated the most. So, is Cuba next? In a way, yes. I have a very strong feeling, sooner rather than later, we're all going to be seeing Ghost of Havana memes. But how that's actually going to play out is not yet set in stone. But on that note, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.